Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to wherever you are around the world. Welcome back again to another Open Learning Campus webinar, and again with the series on PPP identification and screening practices around the world. Today we are going to be focusing on the Netherlands. We have our presenter today is Jan van Schoenhoven. Jan is a senior PPP advisor and for the innovative financing for the government of the Netherlands. He has previously worked with the UN and Geneva as the executive director of the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe's International PPP Center of Excellence. Also with me today, sitting right next to me, we have David Baxter. David is the director of the Institute for Public-Private Partnerships here in DC. He is an international development consultant and PPP expert with over 25 years of experience working primarily in Africa, Eastern Europe, and the United States. So with that introduction, I'm going to turn it over to Jan to give his presentation on.
Thank you very much, Rob, and hi, David. My title is Money Has No Boundaries, You Have to Seduce It. And my subtitle is How to Make a Small Country, a market, attractive for foreign investment. Well, you already said my background. The experience I share with you is in the 10 years I was director of the PPP unit of the Netherlands. And my presentation will cover 3 lessons learned from the Netherlands when we had what we thought was a PPP pipeline. Everything was ready to start, and then we had the lacking interest from the private sector, both investors as companies. And one of our lessons learned was that you always act as a government, but think more like the private sector. And I would like to share with you these discussions. Few things. Where is Holland? It's a small country. What do I mean when nobody is interested? What do I mean by when nobody wants it? How did we seduce them? And how to get next level and wrap up my lessons learned. And always open to questions, of course. The Netherlands is a small country. It's I think one of the smallest countries in the world with 17 million people. We highly depend on export. We are a logistic country where our infrastructure is the gateway from the port of Rotterdam or Schiphol to Europe. And that means that our national infrastructure fund is about 5 billion a year. And you can see during the economic crisis we increased our infrastructure budget. And this is just the budget for road, rail and water infrastructure on a national level. Could our suggestions help? I don't have a very detailed theoretical approach, but when we started with PPP in 2006, we are number 13 on the ranking of the Global Competitive Index from the World Economic Forum at place 13. In 2014, we were number 4 in the world in infrastructure. So our approach and PPP helped us to get at least a better infrastructure. What did I do is when nobody was interested. When we built our PPP program, after years and years of discussing, after much political pressure, and when we were starting discussing with the private sector, amazingly, our pension funds were at that time not interested in our infrastructure. And that is strange, as the Netherlands has at least 2 pension funds in the 10 largest in the world. And if you look at the asset, over 4 trillion of those 2 pension funds is invested in infrastructure. Not scared away, we went to other investors, the other Dutch banks like ING, ABN, and international investors. And we all got the message, we are not really interested. And what turned out is, those who were in favor of a PFI type of project, DBFMO type of project, went to the UK, and France was a safe haven for the concession for the toll road projects. So there was no interest at the Dutch side, for the Dutch pipeline. We also encountered that looking internally, not everybody was applauding for PPP. Although on a political level there was a lot of support, you probably recognize that in your own country, but my department, the Department of Infrastructure, hesitated. What if we put so much power to the private sector? What's in it for me? And secondly, it looked very hard to understand PPP. It was so dominated by the banking sector, so it was very hard for us to understand what's really happening. And secondly, the Dutch private sector, the construction companies, were also hesitating. They had to invest a lot of training and experience, and they said, look, Netherlands government, you promised since over 20 years or 15 years that you do PPP projects. You have your list of PPP projects, but you never start. And secondly, and I think that's maybe typically for the Netherlands, all the local and smaller SMEs complained, said, look, this is only for the big ones, and we are left out. So there was a lot of opposition and there was less appetite. Where did it came from? We actually had two PPP projects operational in, let's say, around 2006. First, there was the high-speed rail from Amsterdam going to Paris. And that was really seen as a UK project. All the advisors were from the UK. I think there were hardly any civil servants in that project. And even when we read the contract, we hardly understood what's in it. We had one second attempt that was a small road in the north of the Netherlands, and the Bank of Local Communities, it's a big bank in the Netherlands, AAA rating, invested. And there I was, starting as director of the PPP unit, with 12 projects in the pipeline and 2 at immediately financial close, a road to the second port of Rotterdam and 1 big road in the middle of the Netherlands. Around €1 billion, and no one was happy to do the project. We had a lot of discussions with the private sector. And what we learned were actually 3 things. Become more attractive than your neighbors. You have to persuade them to invest in your country. And they had an easy way out. The UK for those who love DBFMO projects, and the others in France, Spain to do the toll roads. So why start business in the Netherlands? We also realize if money is the only driver, you have a lot of sympathy in the Ministry of Finance who think, well, PPP projects are cheaper, in time ready. But the Ministry of Infrastructure was surprised that, look, what's in it for us? Of course, we are happy that the project is in time and within budget, but then the road is there for 30 years. And for the PPP unit, actually, when we started projects, I said, look, the PPP unit at the Ministry of Finance is fine, but they have no idea about projects. Who will do the tendering? What will be the rules? And so we had to switch from our bureaucracy approach, building a PPP law, a lot of procedures, to get more an entrepreneurial attitude without losing our identity. As some examples, we thought we had 12 projects. Those projects were assigned by our national parliament. They were in roads, they were in water, in government buildings, in military barracks, museum. But when we started, we had no clue what the Germans were doing, the Belgians, the UK. We heard some, but had no clue. And secondly, we thought, well, let's experiment on all types of PPP because, well, what will work? So we had build, operate, transfer, DBFMO, design, build, finance, maintain, joint ventures, operator management. And I think We had 12 projects and 7 flavors of PPPs. And those were all individual projects. The Ministry of Housing did their projects. The Ministry of Infrastructure did their projects. There was no connection between those projects. And what we learned is that the private sector said, you have a lot of projects, but you don't have a pipeline. That is not what we consider as a pipeline. Every project is new, and every project we have to reinvent what the government really wants. So what we do, we stuck with the 12 projects in the same assets. We made an evaluation what our neighbors were doing. And what we did, we chose one type of PPP contract. All were done in DBFMO. And together with the private sector, we made one standard contract for all projects, with all the same conditions, so the same way of procurement. And we connected all the projects in one PPP program. That means that the project directors were sitting around the table discussing the contract, that people from the PPP unit, each project had 2 staff members working on the project and discussing items. It resulted that not all 12 projects became PPP projects, because some type of DBFMO didn't fit to all, but 7 or 8 went on. And then the private sector, look, this is a pipeline. 8 projects, almost the same identity, that's interesting for us. Again, and you may recognize this, is that we had a very traditional approach for the first 10 years. We had a PPP unit at the Ministry of Finance who said PPP is good, financing will come in, let's do PPP. But the Ministry of Infrastructure said, look, happy when the project is ready, but what are the consequences? And you have a lot of risk allocated in the contract, but if the risks occur, who will pay for it? And they almost thought it was a hostile takeover of the Ministry of Finance of our infrastructure. What are you doing with the roads or waterways which are not in PPP? How do you interconnect them? So what we felt is that the Ministry of Finance had the most inventive financial solution to our problem, but all the challenges and the risks were put in our department. And that had for years strong discussions between the ministries. In the new approach, we said, look, we need PPP and we see the benefits. So, Ministry of Finance, your PPP unit makes the enabling environment. Negotiation with the EU, being part of EPEC. But what's in it for the Ministry of Infrastructure? So, our contract has 2 things. It will reduce the cost overall. So, if we have benefits from a PPP contract that will be cheaper, we all will benefit from it. And one of the main drivers for a small country that is actually a logistic hub in Europe is that traffic jams are ruining our economic growth. So we said we are happy about PPP and we are happy about the project, but when the road is there for 30 years, we want the financial incentive to improve the quality of the road. So high availability. And we will be in charge of the project. It's still our road, it's still our waterways, and we will be in charge. And what we did was the financial benefits and the financial solution of PPP fitted within the infrastructure policy and our own ambition. And then in the Netherlands, all ministries got supported the PPP. And I already said it a little bit. We had traditional a PPP unit at the Ministry of Finance, mostly from the financial sector. But if you really go into projects, the private sector wants to understand the project. What are you doing? How are the land expropriation arranged? How is the road rules and engagements? How will we interact with the traffic control? And there was no project experience in the Ministry of Finance. And secondly, you see that all around the world, there was a lot of theoretically knowledge, a lot of classroom training, but not real project experience. And that's killing no consistency in staff. If you are serious about PPP, it has a face. So what the private sector said, actually you are a hollow shell talk a lot about PPPs, but you have no really additional value if we go into projects. And you have no face. So again, the Ministry of Finance did policy, reporting to the Parliament, reporting to the politicians, and the PPP unit in the infrastructure said, we are the contact persons for the project. So we had highly trained and motivated staff with real project experience, and we were in charge. Professional staff and a face for the private sector made them safe to come to the Netherlands. And actually, to wrap up, the old situation is that the government said, keep calm, we make our PPP pipeline, and the private sector said, that's fine, but we're not interested. So you have to make infrastructure attractable for the private sector. And secondly, although all ministries talk about PPP, their perception is differently, shown by this number. So you have to build a bridge with the demand for foreign investment and also the individual charges or the responsibilities of the ministries. And I won't name the country, but one of the countries I worked in, the PPP environment was quite positive. And then I spoke to the Minister of Health, and he said, no way in my department PPP. That's a sell out to the private sector. And then you have the wrong discussions. And secondly, it's worthwhile to invest in your staff and have a good PPP unit that knows both policy and projects and be a real partner. What was the outcome? We now have on a national level over 60 projects in PPP, where PPP is the preferred procurement principle. Still the same one, DBFMO. We became very attractive because as we did the same procedure over and over again, with the same people from the PPP unit at the government side negotiating, the reduction of cost at the private sector, and that's stated by them, reduced by 30%. The competitive dialogue was hard to start with, but worked. And what you see now is that this type of contract is standard at all assets at government level, and we have a lighter version for subnational level. And our last financial close was one of the biggest CLOCs in the world, in IJmuiden, the second largest after Panama, and there was more interest from the banks that we really needed. It was even so attractive that we didn't even call to the European Investment Bank. What are the lessons learned? To do this, become attractive for the private sector, it's essential that you have really capacity. And that's more than just a PPP certificate. And I'm reading from the book. The things we did, and we also work together with the World Bank and IP3, is innovation of training. The 500 slides training doesn't really help people. So we do simulations. Some people probably in the audience experiences. And what we did was on-the-job learning. We immediately sent staff to the UK and to do France, not to talk, but stay there for 3 years and join a PPP project. Furthermore, the PPP unit coached in PPP projects and the PPP unit. So we didn't say, look, this is PPP, it will save your life, do it and go away and complain if it's not working. No, we stayed at the project and helped. And what's essential, if you don't have tender and project knowledge within the government, you have a hard job. One thing that we said is that the staff we train will remain at the PPP unit for at least 3 years. And I think PPP has so much involved that it's not a financial tool anymore. If you do a PPP project and you do it good, it will save you time and money. That is proven so much around the world. A lot of evidence from the UK audit office, from the Netherlands audit office. But to really go into PPP, to find value for money broader than just it gives you money. So these were the results, and you saw the result. PPP is still operational in the Netherlands. Almost all projects are done in PPP, and we tend to find it very easy to do it. Well, thank you very much, and I'm open to all kinds of questions.
Thank you very much, Jan. If you notice on your screens now, we have the first polling question. We're going to go through our polling questions and then over to David's reaction to all of this. So if you please take a chance to answer the polling questions, and Jan and I will proceed through them. The first question is, do you think your country is attractive for investors in PPP projects? So Jan, so far right now, the numbers are starting to change, or they were starting to change, but it's about 2/3 yes, 1/3 no. So what do you think your reaction? You've had experience in the Netherlands with this, where you thought your country was very attractive to investors, and it turned out when you started, no, it wasn't. You had to change some of the ways you were operating and your approaches. So maybe drawing from your lessons learned for other countries that are in a similar predicament of a small country and they think they have all of this investment potential, but how do they make themselves attractive?
Yeah, I would, and I'm not discussing countries. I think people who live in a country know it well, but I would have two questions for them. If you think your country is attractive for PPP projects, the proof of the pudding is that you have at least 5 projects operational by this time. And secondly is what I encountered, that assumptions is the mother of all mistakes. So if you think your country is attractive, how do you test it with the market? Did you spoke to them? Did you have commitment? So I'm not saying it's wrong, but check if your assumptions are right. And if you think that your country is attractive for PPP, then you have proof of the pudding. And there are a lot of PPPs in tendering phase or even operational.
Next polling question should be popping up shortly for us to move on. There we go. If you take a couple seconds to answer this question, is PPP primarily a financing instrument? So be interesting to see how these numbers change as more people answer. Well, it looks like we're hovering around the vast majority saying no, and a few people saying yes. So maybe if you can address your thoughts on PPP, whether or not it's a primary financing instrument.
My first reaction, I'm very glad that I see 75-25%. I was a little bit afraid that the original thought that everybody would say less, it's a good financial instrument. I'm not saying that it's not a good and very important financial instrument, but I think if you only see it as primarily as a financing instrument, you do not use enough the power of PPP, and it's hard to overcome internal discussions where people questioning PPP, and you can only say, look, it's cheap money, or it's the best way to get money. That works once, that works twice, but in my experience, that is not enough to persuade a government or the private sector to come on board.
And now we'll have the next polling question popping up. So if you take a couple seconds to answer the question here, we'll close. Okay, Jan, it looks like uh, 2/3 say more than 5 PPP projects have reached financial close. Um, I wonder what, the way this question is asked, if there was maybe confusion on whether that referred to the Netherlands having projects that reach financial close, or in their own home country reaching financial close.
Sorry. Yeah.
No problem. But do you want to address maybe what you were driving towards with this question?
Yeah. What I experienced is that starting with the first PPP projects is the hardest thing, because all questions you have to answer at the beginning, more than I think regular projects. So the first one is very hard, and I see a lot of countries stop at 0 or 1 or 2. Actually, what almost would happen to the Netherlands, because okay, it's a financial instrument, but what's the benefit at the end? And the worst thing that can happen is that you have one, like our high-speed rail, that is a successful closing PPP, but then there's a lot of problems in the operational phase. And I'm very curious that the people who said, well, we have more than 5 PPP projects, I will be interested if they say, look, and we will go to 10 and we go to 12, because we had the first mountain to cross, but after that it's a very nice valley, and we will cover all the projects, all the problems, because we are experienced. And I'm very curious what they would say about that.
Okay. Thank you. We're going to move on to the next poll question right here. If you take a couple seconds to answer this, how would you rate the support of the PPP unit? And I assume, Jan, this means in your home country, correct?
My country, that would be 100%, of course, high.
Okay, we have an interesting spread here on the answers. It seems 40% low, 25% medium, 1/3 high in response to this. I'm sure you want to talk about the importance of having political and other support for the PPP unit for your PPP environment to be successful in a country.
Yeah, I would be curious if the people who say who voted for high are the same people that have 5 or more projects, because that would prove some of the ideas. I think, and also if this is the private sector or the public sector that said, how do you rate the support of the PPP unit? But I think the PPP unit has to have 2 tasks. First of all, help to set up an enabling environment for PPP, so a PPP law, tendering procedures, but also be the contact point for the private sector. If you have to call all ministries involved in the PPP project, and if you have to call as a private sector everybody, and everybody has only part of the responsibility, it's building a house and talking with each of the construction workers individually and say, you do the bricks, you do the toilet, you do the stairway. You don't talk to each one individually. And sometimes the government is a group of individual policymakers. And then it becomes very unattractive for the private sector to negotiate. It's a lot of time wasted, money wasted. You never know if you're with the right people. So one of the tasks of the PPP unit should also organize the back office of the government. And then you have good support.
We have one final polling question. I was wrong about that. That was the last polling question. So we are going to now turn over to David for your reaction, your thoughts, your expertise on this.
Well, thank you, Jan, very much. The story you told about the Netherlands trying to attract what you call investment or interest in PPPs in a market which is very competitive, I think, is a good lesson. You have situations, I think, in other parts of the world where this is occurring as well, where there is a very strong economy that is overwhelming smaller neighbors. And I would just think it's relevant to South Africa, where South Africa has an extremely active PPP program. And then there's smaller countries like Lesotho and Swaziland and Botswana, which are trying to launch their own programs, and they're doing their best to attract investors. And people are thinking, well, why should I go to Swaziland when I could go to South Africa? I think the same is also in East Africa, where Kenya is very, very prevalent in that market. And you have smaller countries like Uganda, Burundi, Rwanda, which are also looking at PPPs. And the other one we shouldn't forget is Tanzania. And so they're facing the same situation. But I think what is really important, every country has a chance, and Jan touched on it when he said, he put that little sign up there, be calm. You know, every country needs to be trusting, or to build up a situation of trust and be calm. And I would add in another word is, when you're developing a PP program, be rational. A lot of times people have very excited ideas, they get ahead of themselves, and then they wonder why things fail. And I think rationality is a really important element. The other is, and I heard this was mentioned a few months ago when I was in London at a conference, that funding or money is not sentimental. So you really do have to find a situation where you find that you've got to do something attractive for people to want to invest in your country, otherwise they'll just go to the next market. And Jana, you touched on it where you were talking very much about it's a marketing exercise, selling your country, letting people know why you need to be in the Netherlands, or why you need to be in Swaziland, or why you need to be in Uganda instead of in France, the UK, South Africa, or Kenya. The other element of an introduction of a PPP program, I think, to any country, and you touched on that as well, Jan, is you've got to introduce a sense of entrepreneurship to the public sector. Because the public sector is now going to be working with the private sector in ways it never has before. And so what is really, really important is the public sector's got to start thinking a bit like the private sector, and in many ways the private sector's got to start thinking like the public sector, because you're forming these partnerships and you're binding people together, and you need to find a way to, work together as one team, essentially. On the sense of regional competition, you also find that maybe sometimes to launch large PPP projects, it might behoove countries to look at forming a regional PPP project where there's a leading country that can introduce its neighbors to smaller projects. The one that's in the news recently is the LAPSET project in Kenya, the massive corridor that's being built all the way up to the South Sudan. Any country that gets touched by those projects, whether they're small or big, is going to have an exposure to PPPs which they didn't have before. Jan also touched on one that I think is really important, is political buy-in. Many times there are a lot of people who are very excited. They are champions for PPPs. They work on a strategy, and then, as Jan said, in a situation, you go to a certain ministry and they say, I'm not doing it. So you have 5 ministries that are very excited about doing it, and then one says no, and it kind of deflates the bubble, and everyone goes back to the drawing board. In many senses, there's also realization now with the international economy that there's a balance that you're looking for between global inputs, local influence, and maybe you start to look at glocal, if that's a term that I've heard thrown about recently. So if you're launching projects in your country for the first time, you want to attract companies that have a global experience, because they're going to bring a lot of that experience to the projects, and it's going to filter down, and it's going to help build the capacity in your institution. If you're relying just on local, you might inhibit yourself, and that could be a problem. We also need to get a sense that the banking sector needs to understand what is happening when you talk about private sector or public-private partnerships. I was recently in Kenya, and I was talking to somebody at the Kenyan Treasury, and I asked them, what is the biggest challenge facing you launching your PPP programs? And I thought they would say to me it was, the public sector or the private sector, and they said it was the financial banking sector, because they didn't really understand what PPPs were. And you touched on that, Jan, also when you talked about finding banks in the Netherlands that are willing to invest in projects, because you can have the best pipeline, you can have the best projects, but if you can't get the financing, you're stuck. And that's important, and especially because financing is so competitive. If you can have a certain amount of domestic input that can fill some of that gap, it's good. You need, Jan talked about a pipeline. I would add another word there and talk about a sustainable pipeline, because people can have a massive pipeline, but for example, in Kenya, they have a very large pipeline, but there's been delays in launching the project. So they have a very attractive pipeline that people are excited about, but the projects are coming through. The other is, a country, if it's going to talk about a pipeline, maybe it needs to focus on a specific sector for that pipeline so that they can at least build some expertise. So if a country has energy needs, instead of just trying to do every sort of PPP, try and get as many energy projects launched so that you can build up that expertise. Jan also talked about, and I feel very strongly about that, creating an enabling environment, because any private sector institution that's interested in investing in a country, getting involved in PPPs, are going to look at the enabling environment, see what laws are in place, what protections are in place, how risk is allocated, how arbitration is reached if it's needed, because if they perceive that these situations are challenging, you're not even going to get to start to talk about the risk of the project. You're going to just talk about risk of doing business in that country. And that's a level which people are very, very concerned about. Now, the question that arises, what type of enabling environment do you need? Some countries say you need PPP legislation. Other countries say you need a PPP unit. A very interesting case study is the case of Turkey, where they don't at this time have a PPP enabling environment, but they have some ministries which have developed very robust PPP programs, and these serve as the sort of the pioneers or the leaders for the enabling environment in the country. And the ministries talk to one another. So if one ministry wants to launch a PPP project and it doesn't have a history, for example, in Turkey, then they would go to the Transportation Ministry or the Health Ministry, which have very robust programs. I think the last number I heard is Turkey attracts about 40% of the capital internationally for PPP projects, which is pretty impressive considering they don't have an enabling environment. So, maybe we get so tied up in the semantics of what an enabling environment is, instead of when we should be looking for centers of excellence in a country or institutions of excellence in a country that can drive the project forward. I liked what Jan was talking about is, identifying what type of PPP projects you're going to do. And by that I mean whether it's a design build or whatever. And it was a good idea that the Netherlands decided to focus almost exclusively on DBFMO, design, build, finance, maintain, and operate projects, because this is a full spectrum of activity in a project. Companies who are going to invest in a country's PPP program are cognizant that many of the PPP projects are becoming long-term. So you're looking at projects now that are 20, 30, 40 years. In Virginia, in the United States, where we located, they just recently launched a 99-year PPP project. In Turkey, for example, most of the PPP projects now are 30-year projects, and they structured in a way that there's 3 years for design build, and then the finance kicks in, and there's 27 years for the maintenance and operations. And that's a whole new mindset, because when people get very excited about PPPs, a lot of organizations are focusing on the design, build, and finance, but they're forgetting about the real work. And I saw a cartoon once of people standing, and we signed the deal, and the champagne bottles were popping, and there was all sorts of funny things flying through there, and everyone is excited. And on the side room, there was the project team sitting there looking worried and saying, "Now what?" Okay, so think of that when you want to take it a little further. One thing that's important, Jan also touched on it as well, is that when you design this enabling environment, when you create a situation that is positive for PPPs, when you create a pipeline, it all needs to be tied to a national strategy. Because if you don't have the political buy-in, you don't have a national strategy that people identify with, you don't have bipartisan support, people are going to be terribly concerned. Every time there's a change in government, what happens? I think we're facing that big question now in the United States, where we've got a new administration coming in, and people are waiting to see with a bated breath what is going to happen. So I'll stop there for a minute, but I think just, Jan, a good idea, good ideas that you shared with us, and I just thought I'd add a few comments that maybe expanded a little bit on those.
Well, thank you very much, David. We're going to move into the discussion now. And many of you might be wondering, we've talked a lot about creating an environment, an enabling environment. How does this link to identification and screening? The reason for focusing on this in the Netherlands is that's really what drove, at least in my understanding, and Jan can correct me, how projects are identified and screened, is they learn from their experience to focus on one mode of PPP delivery, and that focuses on what projects will be identified if they will fit in that mode, and it also will focus on the screening process. So we've had a couple of questions along those lines, Jan, and this ties into the political environment and the supports there. So if you could talk just briefly, we have so much we want to talk about in a short period of time. If you could talk briefly about how projects are identified in the Netherlands for PPP, and you've given some very interesting points when you and I have discussed before about Netherlands having a supermajority to pass any infrastructure projects and how that sort of takes politics out of a lot of this. So if you could talk about that just briefly.
In one go. First of all, whatever form of PPP we had, our projects were well structured. So even although they were well structured, there was no interest in the private sector. That's the theme of the thing. And how are projects well structured? We have a 10-year program of infrastructure, a long-term infrastructure program, which is approved not by the government but the whole parliament. There's a large majority who will approve the projects on a national level. So even if you have a change of government, your 10-year program hardly changes. I always make the joke, if you have a left-wing government, the rail will go up because they are not so favor of cars. If you have a right-wing government, the road will have a higher priority. But the projects never change, only the way when we start tendering. And secondly, we do have a calculation for value for money for all projects in infrastructure. For large infrastructure over 60 million, for buildings over 30 million. So we do a financial calculation. If there's no profit in doing PPP, there's no use. But that's not the only one. The second is the more where it fits to our policy. If a main road or a military barrack or whatever fits more in a PPP because it fits into our plans, that's also a reason. So for roads, the reduction of traffic jam is a very hard issue, and we even adapt the PPP program if that is the outcome. When the projects are selected by the government, by the parliament, we do as a government a value for money testing, financially and the impact on our infrastructure. And if that's both is possible, these projects will be PPPs. And then the tendering process starts with the line ministries. We had a big discussion in the Netherlands. Is it good or bad to have the government doing the value for money? In discussions with the private sector, they were very critical. We came to an understanding that we do the value for money because that gives the government assurance that it is really a good deal. And we allowed an independent party to do a audit on our system. And actually, when we did that, there was no really a discussion anymore. We publish our value for money online when we are ready with our evaluation, and everybody can see value for money. Then the Parliament says yes, PPP, and we carry on. And 6 years or 7 years later, you have financial close. That's the minimum time within EU rules.
Just some clarifications, because we've had a question about where line ministries fall into this, and I think just to clarify, line ministries submit their plan for infrastructure that's approved by Parliament, and then there is a financial number where anything above that amount projected cost is considered for PPP. I think we've discussed before that practically covers almost every project that comes through, and then at that point, all of those projects are screened. So that maybe gives the audience an idea of how the pipeline is developed in the Netherlands. Would you agree with that assessment, Jan?
Yeah, very well. A lot of information in Dutch, but if you look at our website, you will see over 90 projects where financial close, what was the value for money, what was the decision for procurement, and sometimes you see value for money is positive, but we didn't choose for PPP, and there's a reason behind it. And we even have a project where the value for money was negative, but we choose for PPP, and we also explained why we choose for PPP, because there were other benefits that fitted our purposes.
That sort of evolves into the screening from our discussions before, and tying it back to the overall discussion we're having about market interest in the project. From my understanding, a big part of the screening process for a project to be considered for PPP is you do a market scan, or you might have an industry day where you see if there is interest in the project for it to actually be a PPP as part of the screening process.
Very practical thing. I think our market sounding days were all in English, and we even did one with Spanish and French translated to attract Spanish and French companies and investors. And nobody speaks Dutch. Yes, 60 million on 7 billion. That's not working. So that's the thing you have to do.
Well, excellent. So hopefully that answers a few questions that Don Lamy and Jose asked. I know I phrased it a little bit differently than what you asked. But there are some more questions here on what is the advantage of standardizing a PPP contract offered when different projects have different challenges. So you have a standard approach. This I can open up to both David and Jan on what the advantages of standardizing a lot of the processes.
Okay, I think the value for standardizing is when you have a situation that is a country that is still launching a relatively new program and it hasn't developed a practice. It's really important that there's some standardization that takes place. However, there could also be a disadvantage of this because the standardization leads to contracts which are templates that are not well thought out, and so you could have an unskilled group of public government or public officials who are trying to launch PPPs, and they keep on using the same template over and over again to the detriment of the project. But I know in the case of the Netherlands, Jan shared that with me in discussions that we've had, that when they came up with sort of standard documents, this was based on many years of experience, based on best practices which they had gathered. So my statement would be is if you're launching a program in a small country and you're trying to attract, look at international best practices and maybe find, some independent consultants or organizations that can really advise you have international practice, but also to build up the institutional capacity of your team that is designing those contracts so that they can have confidence in moving forward. One of the things that I feel very strongly about is there's a good place for lawyers in contracts, but you need to include other technical experts as well when you're setting up standard documents or standard contracts, because lawyers will always go for sort of a very standard, rigid document, but we're finding that contracts are very fluid, the situations around projects when there's a project that's 60, 70, 80 years long now, as you see. If anyone now could tell what it's going to be like in 60 years or 70 years' time, then they're a genius, and what we want to know who those people are. But there is a need for contracts that can be flexible. So standardization is good, but flexibility on top of that is also important.
And Jan, do you have anything to say? This question was from Ibrahim, by the way.
Yeah, it's excellent. Actually, an excellent question. When I started with the Ministry of Health and Buildings, we said, look, one of my ambitions is to have one standard contract to have appetite from the private sector. And they all said it's impossible because every project is different. What you have to realize is that part of the contract, it's not in every detail, that every project is different, but you ask for a service. And if you look from that perspective, the way of service is the same. You want a good hospital for 30 years. And what is good? Then you define the services. And secondly, I think what mostly was standardized in the contract is our risk allocation. It can't be that a project A in the same country says, look, force majeure is at the private sector, and in the same country, another project says, no, we take force majeure. In one project, the private sector says, the private sector, look, you take all the construction risk. And one project says, yes, we do it. And the other project says, no, of course, construction risk is always at the private sector. So a project has its own dimension, but a lot of it can be standardized. And I think what David is correct, it's a compromise. It's not an ideal situation. But what I see is, and nowadays, is that when we started with PPP, standard contract, some projects did not fit into the contract. And that's something different than adopt your contract that everybody fits in. Now you see when we are evolving that the standard contract is losing because we are experienced, the private sector is experienced, and you see that the rigid approach in the beginning is now letting loose, let projects do the same. And then you see that they all look a little bit the same again. But to start up, for the first 5-6 years, choose the projects that fit into your standard to make it easy for the private sector to approach. And then let it go. Let the market do its own thing. It's just for starting up the same business.
It's an excellent counterpoint there. We have a few other questions. We have one from Alan here. It says, while capacity building and marketing strategies are important, fundamentally a PPP project needs to be a financially viable and financeable. What is the profile of projects that reached closure? Are they all user-paid projects, or are some blended finance or subsidies are required? In your experience, Jan, and then I'll turn it over to David.
Yeah, well, we choose in the Netherlands, all our contracts are availability payment. And that has nothing to do with the PPP construction, but in the Netherlands we pay so much tax that a user payment fee would be a political death sin in the Netherlands. We use the amount of financing could be varying. Sometimes local, the road or the building is so much needed also by local authorities that they put in some money. So reduce the amount of money that you would have to be. So blending financing is something that is used a lot, and that's due to our history. User payment is in all infrastructure out of the question. We have a budget. We have our natural resources, gas. That is the infrastructure budget. And we have a few user payment projects, which are also DBFMO based, but because the local government said we will charge our inhabitants a toll fee, but that's not our national policy. So there are, I think, 3 in the Netherlands or even 2. I lost the count.
No, I fully agree with what. Go ahead. I fully agree with Jan said. I think there's one thing that we're talking about projects, are they financially viable and financeable? Especially in smaller economies, one thing that people are going to be looking is the size of the project as well. There's many countries that are trying to launch PPP projects that are only $5, $6, $7 million versus you go to some countries and they're 50 million, or you go to other countries and they're $1 billion. And the thing that really is challenging is the transactional fees and setting up these contracts sometimes can be as expensive, whether it's for a $50 million contract or a $1 billion contract. And so you will find that that can decide, what is going to be attractive and what type of projects countries are going to launch. I mean, and that leads to some of the ideas of maybe even where people start bundling projects together to make them more attractive.
Thank you. And building a little bit, Jan, you were talking about local governments maybe instituting projects in the Netherlands. Jose had asked a question, are there any projects in the Netherlands where the contracting agency is not the central government, for example, a regional or municipal government? And if so, what measures are there in place to secure their commitment to the project, co-financing obligations, penalties if they withdraw, along those lines? And he touches a little bit more how this could relate to other countries. I think we've talked about that, and we can bring in David for that aspect. But Jan, if you could answer.
Yeah, I think there are as much as PPP projects on a local level as on a national level. Having said that, if you look at the way the Netherlands is organized, these are mainly projects where we talk about design, build, and maintain, but the financial component is disattached from the contract. And it's my personal view that if the project is small, and that is possible, but otherwise the financial incentive for the private sector to deliver is gone. And what you see is the other way is that there is a very light financing component. So only to have an incentive, kind of penalty structure, if the private sector does not deliver its promised services. So then you can penalize them. In the Dutch system, all regional and municipal governments have to do a check if they are financially viable to do their commitments. They can't go into a PPP project or another project if there's not enough funding. So the funding is never issued. They never get allowance from the central government to do a project if there's not enough money available now or in the near future. Jose said also something else. Said, look, is the success of the PPP program to the small size of the country? Maybe it is. Look, it's very hard to answer. But what I would say, if you look at a country like Kazakhstan or Kenya, they also have 4 or 5 PPP projects, not 100, like the UK, dozens of projects. So I think a lot of these lessons learned apply if you are a starting country. You tried for the last 5 years to attract private investors, and you have some difficulties. Choose 5 or 6 projects, do them the same way, make them attractive, and then start with it. So I think not the size of the countries, but the number of PPP projects that you really want to bring to market is essential. But of course, it helps if you are in the Netherlands and you have a PPP unit of 25 people and they can go to all projects, because in a bicycle you can drive from the north to the east in the Netherlands in one day. Yes, that helps. It's harder if you have a PPP unit in New Delhi and you have to help out in Hyderabad. Then you have to fly in. So yes, in a practical sense, it helped. I fully agree on that.
Just 2 countries that jump to mind on this, central government versus local government. In South Africa, there's a big emphasis now taking place on municipal level PPP projects, and I would recommend that the listeners to this have a look at that. So They have a national policy for PPPs if it's in the national interest or a national scale type project. And then they also have a new sort of set of PPP laws which are relevant for local government. And that has unfortunately resulted in a little bit of conflict between the central government and the local government, because there's a question often of who has the authority over the other. That's really important to consider. The other is Kenya, where recently they decentralized their government and they've decentralized a lot of the decision making on PPPs down to the county level. Mm-hmm. And that's a good idea when it allows counties to have a voice. But there's only maybe 5 or 6 counties in Kenya that have the capacity to launch municipal projects. So it means the other 30 plus whatever are left over are disadvantaged. So it varies between countries. And then just you can throw in the United States, where we don't even have a national PPP program. It's like working with 50 different countries here, because each state has its approach. So there's no right or wrong. There's just a realization that if an organization or a private sector company internationally is looking at a certain market, that they really understand the national incentives, the national policies, and national programs versus that of local government.
And Jose, on that part, and the rest of the audience, we have another webinar in a few weeks that may touch more on local versus national conflicts. It will be a better example than Netherlands, where, like Jan said, everything is very close together. So I'll talk about that at the end. I think we've reached the end of our time here. So I want to just offer for David first, and then Jan to just give any final comments or closing statements based on what we've talked about today.
I think for any country that's looking at launching, a small country that's launching a program in a very competitive market against neighbors that are much larger, is be assertive, know what you want, talk with confidence, have a good plan, sell yourself, and deliver projects or expose people, the market, to projects that are really feasible and viable.
Thank you, David. Jan?
Yeah, thank you. What I would say to these lessons learned, and we became successful because we did projects. And I think my main theme is start doing your projects. Discussion about PPP laws, about how to do this, what are all the risks. If you want 100% certainty, never do PPPs. If you want to use the benefits and are willing to have a compromise between 100% security and being flexible to adapt to the risk, then go for PPPs. And I think that's the lesson. That if you would never do one project, you would never learn. So start working and accept some challenges.
And David, thank you very much for another very successful webinar. It was very interesting. For our audience out there, thank you very much. We didn't get to all of your questions, but we are available. If any questions need to be answered, I can figure out how to answer them offline. For coming up in the future, we do have 2 more webinars scheduled on this topic. One is next Tuesday on the 29th on South Korean PPP, and that will be at a different time. It will be at 5 p.m. Eastern as opposed to the normal 10 a.m. Eastern time. And then getting to Jose's question, and on December 13th at the normal 10 a.m. time, we will have a webinar on Virginia, the state of Virginia, Commonwealth of Virginia's PPP program, and that will get to the point of national versus local implementation of PPPs. So thank you all very much again. Thank you for participating. All of the webinar information is up on the screen. Please give your feedback. We would very much appreciate your feedback on this. And the link will be available in a day or two for you to share with friends and coworkers. Again, thank you very much. I look forward to seeing you again next time. Have a very good morning, good day, good afternoon, good evening, and good night.